Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor to see you today and welcome you to the fourth day of the Design Doha Forum. My name is Jelena Trkulja and I'm the editorial director of the forum. Today's topic is design ecosystems, and we will hear three panels that in various ways connect to this topic of creating ecosystems for design. We will begin with a panel that considers education. This is the panel entitled Innovation by Education, Design's Role in Social and Economic Development. And now I would like to invite Amir Beyrbich, Dean of Virginia Commonwealth University School of the Arts in Qatar, to introduce his panel. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we can pass it. Good afternoon and welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Jelena, for the introduction. My name is Amir Beyrbich, as Jelena indicated, and I have the pleasure of serving as a moderator for this panel on design education and its role in social and economic development. To briefly introduce myself, I'm a designer and educator, and when I'm not moderating this panel, I have the honor of serving as the Dean of Virginia Commonwealth University School of the Arts in Qatar. And I just want to give a quick hello to the amazing VCU students, faculty, and alumni, many of whom are with us this evening, and many of whom are participating in the Design Doha biannual. Before we begin, allow me to take a moment to also acknowledge the incredible people who have made Design Doha biannual and the Design Doha Forum such a success. The design community is thriving in Qatar, and what we have experienced over the last few days is so exciting and meaningful. Congratulations to the organizers, to the curators, editors, and everyone involved in making it happen. This panel will address the potential of design and design education to be a catalyst for social progress. We aim to discuss the role of design education in a quickly changing world and as part of a larger, complex, and quickly changing educational framework. Furthermore, we would like to touch on how schools or academic programs can ensure relevance in relation to the moment, to the time in which they exist, and relevance to the local context, while at the same time participating in global developments and discourses in design. I'm honored to introduce our panelists, and I was told not to read their full bios in the interest of time, and to only state briefly their names and their current roles. Certainly you can read their full bios in the program. Merriam Al-Homaid is an interdisciplinary designer and artist based here in Doha. She's a faculty member in the graphic design department at VCU School of the Arts in Qatar, and she's actually exhibiting in the Arab Design Now exhibition as part of the Design Doha biannual. Kevin Meitzl is an architect and a trustees professor of architecture at the American University of Sharjah, AUS. He previously served as chancellor of AUS, among many other leadership roles at that university. And I also know that some of Kevin's former students are in the audience this afternoon. Crystal Williams is a teacher, leader, advocate, and poet who serves as the president of RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design. There was a little RISD reunion yesterday taking place at VCU Arts Qatar, which was fun. And Michael Rock is a founding partner and executive creative director of 2x4, a global design consultancy in New York City focused on brand strategy, work for cultural and commercial clients. He holds faculty positions at Yale and Columbia Graduate School of Architecture, and I just learned also sits on the board of RISD. So welcome to our panelists, and I will start. This will be a fluid conversation, but I do have some questions prepared, and I will start with you, Crystal, if I may. I recently read an interview you gave, and I really loved your answer to a question about what led you to become an educator, and especially why you remained in academia. You talked about the privilege of being able to think critically about the world around us. I'm wondering if you could share some of those thoughts with us here as a kind of an introductory statement, and how does your commitment to education extend into education in design and the arts?
Before I answer that, I just want to say I'm so thrilled to be here. It's my first time in Qatar, and I am so thankful for the warm welcome that I've received. It's a beautiful city, and it's been a wonderful time being here with some of our alums. Michael's also an alum. I have alums and I'm thrilled that students are here in the audience. So I think that the value of an education, which we really should understand to be a privilege, and so much of the world does not have the opportunity to be educated, calls us to think critically, provides us with the skills and tools with which to navigate a very complex world, allows us to move as advocates for ourselves and our others and our communities, and moves us towards a kind of personal and community freedom. And by that I mean the ability to act in service of, in an informed way that pulls forward the context and histories from which we emerge. I think that is essential, and it is an essential quality of education. When I then turn that to thinking about artists and designers, what I know is that we, artists and designers, inform so much of how the world interprets itself, how we live, whom we make things for, why we make those things. We inform the narratives of the species going forward. We change beliefs and therefore actions. We are all of the things, often working very quietly. I can't think of a single social movement, for instance, in which artists and designers did not play an essential role in moving forward an agenda of equality, progress, safety, and so forth. So when I map then the value of critical thinking to the role of artists and designers as change makers in the world, these two things to me are essentially bound. And I stay in education because I believe that artists and designers can change the world. And so I want to educate and help educate more artists and designers so the young people can go out into the world and do the thing that only artists and designers can do. And I want them to do that from a space of freedom, right? To bring their particular unique skills to bear in the world. So that's my answer.
Thank you. I love that. And I'll turn to you, Michael, as a kind of an extension of that question and that point with a long and remarkable career as a designer across the world. You've observed the evolution of design and witnessed shifts in the expectations placed on designers over the years. So what, in your opinion, will be the essential skills, experiences, knowledge for the future designer? For what should they be preparing, or for what should the schools be preparing them?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for everyone coming. I was thinking that with so many students in the audience that you're going to retire from your design careers in 2070, and I can guarantee you your professors have no idea what that means or what you're going to need in 2070 to finish your careers. And thinking of that, I graduated from graduate school 40 years ago, and my professors had no idea what we'd be dealing with in AI or these things. And so it's kind of fumbling through the darkness trying to imagine a future that we can't fully understand. And so I think that as a design professor, you're always pushed between these two extremes. In one way, there's a vocational need. We want everybody to get a job and to be able to to leave school and find something to do. On the other hand, we have to be mindful of this 2070 problem, that you have a very long career ahead, that the things that you learn have to be sustainable and sustaining for decades. And therefore, you have to find a balance between skills and immediate knowledge, and then something deeper that I think that is really, that you hold inside and that you keep applying to your work over a long period of time. And I think a design career is always this combination of deduction and induction, in the sense that design has a logical side to it, it has an analytical side, you have to be able to go and really think through ideas. But there's always that inspirational, the creative leap that you can't really understand completely. And so one thing prepares you for the other, to really deeply go into something and then to be open to this point where something happens, you're inspired, you have this creative leap that happens. And I think that combination of being thoughtful and smart and logical and analytical is always appropriate for design, and then to have that freedom to take the leap when the time comes. And somehow that will be always applicable no matter now or 2070. So.
Thank you. And maybe, Kevin, for you, a sort of a related question, but focused more on the educational landscape in this region. You've dedicated, a substantial portion of your professional academic journey to the American University of Sharjah, starting from its early days in the late 90s, and spanning a period of notable growth in the UAE and in the Gulf region, socially, culturally, economically. You also played a significant role in the evolution and transformation of a university. So, as a professor and institutional leader, how do you define success? And what timeline should we assess the success of educational projects?
I often refer to it, I would say 5-5-50. That one can begin to look at, because I think design education at its best is transformative. And if we look at what happens to a student 5 months in to a design education, how has a curriculum, how has a pedagogy around design began that process of transformation? What do we see after 5 years, once a student is graduated, in terms of that transformation? Those are, for me, are short term. I've been very fortunate to be involved with building an institution, building a design program that responds to the region. And I realized very quickly that my contribution, it's not going to be measured in my time at the university. It's more likely going to first be measured in 50 years. Because I think it takes that kind of time to move from the individual transformation to broader societal transformations and to begin to understand how design can inform the development of societies, of economies over time. It's a slow process. It's long, it's arduous, not always successful. And I think the proof of that in that really you don't see many programs that can be sustained over long periods of time because it is so incredibly difficult.
No, thank you for that. And I guess that brings me to a sort of a related question, which is that, it's a slow process. It requires patience. We're invested in a 50-year span, yet here in Qatar, in neighboring countries, we see progress and development happening very, very quickly. So how does one sort of intersect these seemingly different timelines, if you want?
I would say you can't have success unless you're committed to the 50-year timeline. The success is going to become much quicker. It's extremely heartening when I walk down and I see, as we walk in, the blue board and the number of AUS graduates that are represented there, right? That's over the 25 years that I've been there. And it's only because of a commitment that is beyond oneself, that is to that 50 years, that you can have the success in 5 years or 25 years, in my view.
مريم, you've grown up in Qatar, you studied here, you spent much of your professional and academic life as a designer and an artist and a professor working in Qatar. I know that your father is a well-regarded and pioneering Qatari artist, and thank you for being here this evening as well. You come from a creative family, so you have had the chance to observe Qatar's creative community over a long period of time. How has Qatar changed? And specifically, how has the creative community changed?
That's a great question. Thank you so much, Amir. As you introduced, my dad's an artist, so I have grown in his studio. He's also an art educator. He used to teach in Qatar University, which offered the fine arts program for 20 years. And back when I was young, I used to go to his classes, and I used to be inspired by what the students do. But what's nice about it is that part of the observation of the education in Qatar, of the creative education in Qatar, is that before that there was art and design has always existed in Qatar, but there was no, I would say, appreciation or highlighting these kind of crafts and art and design. So my father, back in the 70s, he formed a group of artists. They formed of 3 people that called the 3 Friends. And he wanted to raise awareness about this idea of the creative community. So he basically used to go to the community to kind of introduce them to the art and design, in his case, paintings. So I've kind of heard these stories from him, and I've also witnessed and observed the classroom in which he taught. And then, of course, VCU came, and I was a student, and now an educator. And I've seen a dramatic change, especially in the past 25 years since the existing of VCU. And when I was a student, I entered in 2006. It was a completely different landscape or a completely different audience. The students would come into the school or would apply to the school to get the certificate, basically, and then just get a job, and then that's it. But right now, as you can see, and as the Arab design now celebrates, we have a lot of our alumni who are contributing to the creative economy as well as the creative education. So within 25 years, it's a kind of a dramatic change, but it's adding to the community and the vision of the future of design in the region as well as Qatar.
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you.
Can I just add something, which is, I think I'm the only of, clearly Miriam, I'm the only of us this is their first time in Qatar. And one of the things that I've been visiting museums here, and I'm a person who grew up going to museums and finding the stories that I saw in Diego Rivera's panels, big panels in Detroit's Art Institute, spoke to me. And my father worked for Ford Motor Company, and so those big murals of industrialization, I saw myself reflected. And I've been thinking as I've been going through Qatar's museums about the heart and the spirit of Qatari people and what it must mean in a relatively short period of time to be able to experience so much art when you go, the artists sort of pulling together through the story of multiple kinds of art, multiple disciplines in the museums, showing the self back to the people that did not exist. So I'm interested this is a question of the heart. When you were little, I mean, you grew up in your dad's studio, so that's one thing. But when you were little, how did the heart feel, and does it feel differently now that there are museums and so forth to go to, so many?
I would say I was fortunate. I was one of those kids or children who were fortunate because, we had the National Museum. It was the old building in which you can view inside the new building right now. And my dad used to take me there, and I used to see things. But I was always surrounded in my father's studio, and the free time that I had was basically within a creative kind of environment. And then for me, it was shocking, actually, since we're talking about education. It was shocking for me when I went to school. I was in a government school, and we had, we call it Fanniya, class al-Fanniya, which is basically a fine arts drawing class, but it wasn't taken seriously. So for me, it was like a cultural shock. It was like shocking for me. So whenever the class would come, I would really get excited, but then everybody else, including the professor or the teacher, it's like a free time class. So that was a shock for me, and I didn't understand that kind of phenomena. But then luckily, the art education and VCU came to Qatar, and then it's very, very different. But right now, actually the high schools and the government schools have realized the importance of art education as well as design. In fact, I think we're opening a new high school that is dedicated to art and design sometime soon.
Yeah. Maybe a question for you, Crystal, just sort of on the heels of what you started, and that is, I've heard you emphasize the value of plurality of perspectives, and you just said that this is your first time in Qatar. So I'm curious, to what extent or how do examples from outside the US, from a place like Qatar that you're visiting now, how do they inform the way you think about your work or life?
I'm not going to answer the question about my life. That's a long answer. I will say that Rhode Island School of Design has been thinking in the last decade or so very seriously about the value of plurality and the value of difference as a means by which to broaden and deepen art and design practice. So we have students from, I think, 37 countries. Actually, 37% of our students are international students, right? And they come from, I think, 56 countries. I've got faculty from all over the world. Mariam came. And so the value of different perspectives, different traditions, different practices in terms of creating and instigating elastic thinking for artists and designers of all backgrounds is essential. And I think it's essential for this century. I think that the designers and artists who will be most powerful and most impactful in the world will be those that have a kind of fluency and a familiarity with many different arts practices. I shun the idea, for instance, that there is primacy in any arts practice. You know? Our history as a species is too diverse and long for me to believe that the art of Italy is more important than the art of the Navajo, is more important than the art of Qatari, is more important than the art of Senegal. I don't believe any of that. I think all of these forms and practices are essential, and they define who we are and can offer us a way of thinking about who we might be, which is, I think, equally important and often lost. Artists have a vision for how we might be, and there's an American scholar named Daryl Smith who has it's a kind of analogy and about diversity. And she asks, if you have an illness and people have a hard time defining what the illness is, do you want just the pediatricians looking at you? Or do you want the oncologists, the pediatricians, the hematologists, right? Do you want a team that brings different perspectives to bear on trying to diagnose what is going on? Maybe some people just want the pediatricians. I want everybody. I want all of the expertise in the room to come and look at the problem. And I think the world's problems are sufficiently complex these days, right? The planet, racism, sexism, all of the things. That we need all of the perspectives, so we need all of the artists and all of the designers from all of the places at the table making their art. And that's sort of where we are at RISD right now.
Yeah, no, thank you. And Michael, maybe a related question or an extension of that. You've worked obviously on projects across the world, including here in Qatar. How do you address or respond to the need for contextual relevance, ensuring that your work resonates in places or cultures that are different from the ones you come from? And can you just tell us about your experience working in Qatar?
Yeah, sure. This is my 15th year working here, and I think sometimes when you live here, you don't realize how extraordinary what's going on here is. You know, I was saying it's like if you built MoMA, the Met, the Guggenheim, the Whitney, all in 1 year or something like that. You know, it's history on steroids. And so for a designer, it's amazing because you see ideas start and come to completion in a very short amount of time. And so if design is setting out a plan and then executing on that plan, you see how that plays out in such a visceral way here. And things happen, for instance, where I'm from in New York, much slower, right? So, you know, the idea of starting a new museum and then suddenly having it operational takes years and years and years, and here it happens very quickly. And so, to me, Doha is a kind of laboratory where designers can see ideas play out in full scale, like a kind of full-scale prototyping or something like that. And I just think about how radically it's changed since when I first started coming here till now, and how the vision that was set out, it was so strong that you see basically how it plays out in all these different places. And so it's a really remarkable experience. You know, I come maybe 2 or 4 times a year. Each time I come, there's something completely changed or completely new. And so in that way, you really, whenever you work somewhere else, you really get involved in the spirit of the place. But I think to address your question really is about how to be relevant in a place. And, you know, I think you have to be modest. You have to realize that you come to work in partnership with people. You don't come to impose your idea on a place, and that all the work that we've done here has always been really deeply collaborative with the people who are here and living it. and to try to share what we know from our experience around the world, but also to really learn from being here in this place that's happening so fast, changing so fast. So I think it's really about trying to immerse yourself as deeply as you can in the place you are, trying to make really real connections and collaborative connections, and being modest enough to realize that you aren't here to change things, you're here to kind of learn together.
Thank you. Kevin, I'm familiar with your work related to notions of identity and the built environment in the Gulf specifically, and this, I read essays of yours related to the fear of loss of a past or of tradition. You touch on the oscillating and complicated relationship towards design work that is perceived to be imported from abroad. Can you discuss the sort of intricate challenges that designers and architects face as they navigate these questions in the Gulf? And where do you envision opportunities for meaningful work? And I think Michael touched on certainly one example of that, or some examples of that.
Yeah. It's a complex question. And I think the danger is to essentialize and reduce down. I think too often we rely on terms without interrogating their meaning. We use the words identity, we use the words tradition quite often. In my view, we don't spend enough time interrogating what is meant by them. And ultimately, for me, it's not about the answers, but it's about the questions we frame and we formulate. And so I think part of design education's role is to begin that process of formulation of critical and rigorous questions, to always ask the why. It's through the asking and the re-asking of those questions and engaging in a dialogue that we come to some understanding. And that understanding, I think, may be fleeting. Because I think also a complementary danger is essentializing the past and not asking who's past, at what time, who are we privileging or who are we excluding. So I think that it ultimately, and I think it's a rich place, the Gulf, contemporary Gulf is an incredibly rich place with an incredibly rich history and a very complex history. And that's, for me, what makes it so interesting, is to begin to ask those questions about what we mean and to instill in future designers that ability to ask questions, not to settle on an easy answer, but to continually ask themselves questions, engage in a dialogue with others and with themselves, to attempt to, because ultimately as designers, we have to make. And for me, that's the interesting tension, because we have to ask the questions, but we also have to make things in the world. And I think part of that for me is once you make the thing in the world, you have to critically self-reflect on the thing made and say, when I iterate through again, would I do the same thing? If the answer is yes, I think there may be a problem.
But Kevin, I'm interested because I think, this idea is when you're teaching, you're always bringing certain histories to bear. You're bringing certain examples to bear. And I think that asking that question about whose history and what are you showing, because we become agents and implicated in this kind of ideologies that we put forth, right? And I was really struck, Miriam, what you were saying earlier about part of what you see in the work now is recovering things that have been forgotten or looked over, or and I think that we have to constantly remind ourselves somehow, like, what are we forgetting? What are we not bringing to classroom? What are we not privileging in the classroom? And then that's why that work comes back again through what we're seeing today, I think.
And I would say very quickly, I think one of the ways in which to address that question is, for example, as an architect, we often use precedents as a means of looking at the past to see what it can teach us about the present. And I think it's interesting to look at, let's say, a typology that transcends time and space, meaning it may appear in Mughal India, it may appear in the Renaissance in Europe, and it could appear throughout the Middle East. And so for students to begin to see that there is no ownership of that typology. There is a recurrence of that idea, and why is that idea recurring in different contexts? To begin to open up conversations.
I just want to add a few things from my own perspective. I'm teaching at VCU in the graphic design department, and right now I'm co-teaching a synthesis class with Basma Hamdi, who is in the audience. And although we encourage students to look at references and the histories and things like that, and I understand that sometimes when we talk about the history, we get stuck to the history and we can't open up. But at this moment, at this very moment, with the design education and the design curriculum that we have here at VCUQ, I'm just speaking on behalf of our class, we have students who are looking into the past, the present, but also the future. I mean, I can give an example. We have a student right now, Katham Al-Fakhro, who's looking into old currencies and current currencies, but also taking that history and tradition and graphics and typography and thinking about the future, how the future would look like, you know, in terms of maybe cryptocurrency or in terms of looking back into traditional banknotes or coins and things like that, but then keeping that identity and history. Because we don't want the future to be monotone in a way. We still want our identities and characteristics and our challenges as educators, how can we cultivate this curiosity within the students and within this upcoming generation by celebrating their histories, but also looking into the future. Because I mean, from this my personal perspective, I feel like a lot of the students who especially come from this region, they are fearful of the loss of the identity as well as the language. You know, the classic Arabic language. So that's why a lot of the students, there's almost like a starvation for looking back into the classic Arabic and the history. And so there's always a need. There was a moment when I was doing my bachelor's where like we needed everything to be modern, we needed everything to be Latin, we needed everything to be westernized. But right now I think the next generation, the people that I'm teaching right now, there's more of a starvation towards looking into the history, but then also thinking about the future. Yeah. So
maybe you can elaborate a little more, Miriam. And I prepared this question, which is to say that at VCU we often talk about ourselves as sort of when are we at our best, and we like to say that we're at our best when our work is inspired or derived or informed by the local context, but at the same time kind of plays or participates in a global discourse of design. So could you say a few words about your own creative practice and how that fits into that framework? Because I think it does.
Thank you for this question. My current research or my current work that I produce textile work mainly, but I also do other things, use technologies such as AR and VR and things like that. But my recent work is mostly textile. And with the textile work, some people view it as nostalgic, but I also view it as documentation of the present. So the documentation of the ever-changing landscape of Doha. But I also have, of course, future plans to document the region as well, and the changes that we go through, whether it's architecture or language or lifestyles. Because even the way we talk, like some words I say in the class in my local dialect, my students would be like, So it's really important for us as designers to document the present as well as the past, but also looking into the future in some ways. Yeah. So
I think what's interesting to me about questions of the sort that we're answering right now is that sometimes we fall into a habit of thinking in binary terms. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the great values of art and design is that there are so many different kinds of artists and designers, right? And so that the question of nostalgia does not have to be a static question. That is to say, nostalgia is not necessarily a threat to forward thinking. In my view, it is simply what it is, as long as it does not become the only way in which we engage, right? So that I'm a poet, so there are poets who are strict formalists. Great, I'm glad that they're in the world of things. We need people to keep the sonnet, right? And then there are poets who are completely in the opposite direction. Great, we need those people. So I worry sometimes when we're talking that we both diminish the folks who are sort of thinking and really wanting to preserve the past, the archivists in some ways, and elevating to the detriment of the entire arc of the making practices, the folks who are really pushing the bounds. I hope at RISD that there is room for all of that. Like if somebody wants to just be thinking about 1947 red yarn, great. You do that because there's value in that in some way. Now, finding a job doing that may be a different thing, but
Yeah.
no.
This next question, I'm sort of remembering the conversation we had when we got together before this panel, and it's a question of sort of how do we do it all as schools, as educators, as academic programs? Because there's a lot to unpack, and certainly there's a lot to get to in a span of 4 years of a typical academic program. You know, when I was preparing for this, I was meaning to ask you, Michael, how do you do it all? You're a designer, you're a writer, you're an academic, right? So that's how the question was prepared. But in the conversation, we realized that we have a lot to say on this topic. So maybe this is an open-ended question, but how do we balance the need to address the professional, the disciplinary elements while simultaneously taking into account some of the things we already discussed, the local and the global, ensuring that we graduate responsible citizens, thoughtful people, et cetera, right? How do we do it?
Yeah, I think about that a lot, and I think that I'll think about graphic design, and how it kind of doesn't exist anymore. It's fragmented into so many different pieces. So trying to hold it together as a discipline, I think, is maybe a problem, and maybe disciplines need to splinter and become new things, because you have people who design type, and you have people who design interfaces, and you have people who think about AI, and you have people who think about branding. There's so many different things, and they're not necessarily even related so much anymore. They become very distinct kind of practices. And so I wonder, there's a couple different things. One is to break things into smaller chunks so that you can go deep into some things. Or I've been thinking a lot recently about that maybe design education should always be in between things. And so, for instance, at RISD, there's a series of departments like landscape and textiles and graphic design, and maybe you should always be between textiles and graphic design, or textiles and landscape, as a way to focus both of them. So if you're between textiles and landscape, you're thinking about the environment, you're thinking about information in the environment. If you're thinking between textiles and between graphic design and textile, it's probably very close to what you're doing, right? Where you're thinking about matrices and how weaving and things like pixels go together. And so if you always think about your practice stretched between two other practices, suddenly it becomes really vital or really focused that way. So.
Yeah. Perhaps the way that people nowadays talk about their own living situation. I live between Berlin, New York,
Right.
and Shanghai.
Well, it's like the hyphen is the new
textiles and photography.
Like I'm a DJ chef or something like that, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's like the hyphen is kind of the contemporary way of thinking about that tension at all times, right? Yeah.
Do you find, a question for you, Alec, I mean, at RISD, we find our students really pushing to operate not just between two disciplines, sometimes 3 and 4. They want to study textiles and furniture and apparel design and something else. Yeah. And that's, I think, a measure of the generation, but also how they're experiencing the world, which is not the way the world was experienced 20 or 30 years ago. Are you finding that here?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And what are you doing about it?
We find that in the crossovers among the various departments at the school. We find that in some of the students' involvement in research labs that we have at VCU. We find that in the context of Education City, where students, collaborate with others, with their peers in other schools from very different disciplinary sort of domains. So yeah,
but I think actually what's interesting is that by combining, it's not expanding, it's actually focusing. It's so when you do textile plus apparel plus illustration, that's a focus, not an expansion. And because suddenly you deal with something in a much more specific way. And I think that's what's really interesting. You kind of focus by addition somehow. Yeah.
I think that this working across disciplines, having these broad interests, I think it's a wonderful thing. As long as we don't lose sight of the importance of the fundamentals and understanding at some fundamental level what constitutes a piece of furniture. Not only a piece of furniture in its making, but a piece of furniture in the way that it acts. So Joseph Rickford wrote a very interesting essay now, probably 40 years ago, called The Sitting Method. and which he talks about the ways of sitting that may be culturally specific. The way in which we engage with the piece of furniture. Do we sit high? Do we sit low? Do we sit on the floor? Because I think that's as much a part of what we as designers need to consider when we consider this broad term culture, and that we don't lose. And unless we are steeped in that, knowing the fundamentals of sitting and the fundamentals of making of a piece of furniture, something could potentially be lost. So I think it may be a question of time and sequence in which one expands their horizons.
But could you have a department of sitting, for instance?
No, no department of sitting, Michael Rock.
No, but it's a serious question in the sense like not specific to a material or something else, but to a kind of problem that you could bring to bear many different kinds of disciplines to that or something.
I think one certainly could, but it also, once we translate into the making, right? I mean, there's the understanding of material reality and how one works with, transforms, challenges the nature of materials that, done well, takes a lifetime to master. But, yeah.
So I would just build on this. I was going to say the tension that we experience is the transdisciplinarity that students want to pursue versus the orientation of the RISD education, which is the T, which is breadth of discipline, depth of knowledge in a discipline, right? So let's think about textiles. We have a jacquard loom. There are a series of sequenced courses that one takes in order to really understand how to weave a particular kind of fabric, what to do. We are challenged by the fact that we have these young people for 4 years, and there are a series of points of knowledge that they need, or our faculty think they need, in order for them to graduate and be educated in that thing, which allows them to go out and be productive citizens. That tension is not one, frankly, that we have learned, that we have mastered yet. And it sits big and fat in front of us right now. And I do think, I mean, it's something that we're thinking about, and other schools have created departments of sitting, right? The problem is, sometimes you're then graduating dilettantes. And so the question then for you as an employer is, do you want to hire the person who has essentially an inch sort of knowledge, or do you want to hire the person who has 10 inches of knowledge? And I'll complicate it even more by saying what I understand from my alums. I was just talking to one earlier today, architecture major, making furniture and lighting and textiles now. And what she's done is to translate her ability to learn something deeply, a material deeply, a practice deeply, into other practices. So the ability to learn something deeply is itself a skill. And she, over time, has recognized that. And she's like, okay, for me to learn this, I had to do blah, blah, blah. I will attribute that skill in this discipline now. My worry is that if we don't give them that skill, that they won't be able to pivot gracefully from one thing to another thing, which is what these young people, I think, are going to have to do. They're already doing it, but I think as time goes on, the world is going to require more of that. That's the worry.
I think it goes back to the 2070 problem, right? Because going really deep into the technology of jacquard will only take you so far, because that technology will transform. And so the knowledge has to be deep in a different way somehow. I think Miriam's work, if you haven't seen it, is fantastic. Textiles that she's making, it is an example of the tension somehow, because you're clearly a graphic designer and a typographer, but you're also a textile designer and a weaver, and so that those things are informing each other. So I would imagine that the way that you're making graphic design is really informed by the way that you're making textiles, and that they kind of bounce back and forth between them. But somehow underlying both of those is some compositional knowledge of color, knowledge of the way forms go together, that transcends all of those things, right? You can apply them to everything. And so there's specific knowledge in terms of your knowledge of textile, but then a kind of general knowledge, which is your knowledge of composition.
And that's why I want to just go back on our curriculum. And I don't want to speak on behalf of graphic design, but I will speak on behalf of our class, the synthesis class, which is the last class that our graduates do. And basically, although it's a graphic design department and we deal a lot with typography and image making and things like that, we give them the freedom to choose their medium. So if students want to do textile work, they can. If they want to do interface design, they can. If they want to use AI, they can. So for us, we try to give them the foundation and the tools and the critical thinking behind it, and then the design systems. And then we kind of leave it up to them as a researchers to kind of research these topics and mediums and tools to expand upon their design practices. Yeah.
I think I asked the question because I am very aware of the challenge of ensuring that graduates, that students have both the depth and the breadth. And how do we do all of that in a finite number of years of an educational process, of an undergraduate education? I mean, as a graphic designer, I know how long it takes to actually see letter forms and space between letters in order to set type properly. Now, that may not get me to 2070 because there may be a way to do that that doesn't require that skill, but having the patience to do that might take me to 2070. And I think that's what gets to your point, Crystal, that you were making. Yeah.
But you could have a department of reading, maybe, that would, they could deal with all those issues, right?
Yeah.
With technology, with typography, with all those things, so that would be all under the rubric of reading.
Right. Yeah, that's right. I think in the interest of time, I have many more questions that I prepared, but I realized that this panel started late, and we are going to wrap it up here. I want to thank the esteemed panel. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you, Crystal, Michael, Kevin, and Miriam, and thank you all for being here this evening.